Fugitive arrested. Prison guard tears her uniform. But what he sees shocks everyone. Rate my story from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important. And subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The orange jumpsuit ripped with a dry sound that echoed through the cold jail cell. The 30-year-old woman instinctively tried to cover her back with trembling hands, but it was too late. The corrections officer stopped in the middle of the mandatory search, his eyes fixed on the hundreds of scars that formed a grotesque pattern on her skin. They weren't random marks from fights or accidents. They were systematic, organized, as if someone had used her skin as a map of suffering. She had been captured after 3 days on the run through the grimy streets of the industrial city, 3 days drinking puddle water, sleeping in dark alleys, always looking over her shoulder. When they finally found her, she was passed out near a dumpster, still clutching a plastic bag with empty pill bottles. The imposing man who now observed her was known for his professional detachment. During 5 years working at the correctional facility, he had never shown compassion for any inmate. His movie star good looks and rigid posture intimidated even the most violent criminals. But something about those scars disturbed him in a way he couldn't explain. The inmate quickly pulled the torn fabric to cover her back, avoiding his gaze. Her hands trembled not only from the cold, but from a vulnerability that went far beyond the current situation. She knew that look of shock and morbid curiosity. She had seen it in doctors, social workers, and anyone who accidentally discovered her marks. The corrections officer finished the search in silence, his hands now hesitant where before they were mechanical and efficient. As he led her to the cell, he watched how she walked with hunched shoulders, as if trying to become invisible. With each step, more questions formed in his mind. How old was she when this happened? Who had done this to her? And why, even after so many years in the prison system, did that vision affect him so much? During the first week, he tried to forget what he had seen. He maintained his normal routine, treating her with the same professional indifference that he showed to all the other inmates. But in his free time, he found himself thinking about those scars. They told a story of suffering that went far beyond anything he had ever witnessed. Her rap sheet was surprisingly simple: theft of medication from a downtown pharmacy. There was no history of violence, drugs, or other crimes. Just that one episode that had brought her there. For someone with so many marks of trauma on her body, it was strange that this was her first time in the system. 3 weeks passed before he mustered the courage to ask the first direct question. During dinner delivery, when she was sitting on the concrete bed, reading a book borrowed from the prison library, he paused at the cell bars longer than necessary. The question came out harsher than he intended. She looked up from the book, and for a moment he saw something that wasn't fear or anger. It was weariness, a deep weariness of someone who had told that story many times to people who never really managed to help. She replied that she had grown up in a group home until she was 18. After that, she tried to live on her own, but the after effects of her childhood made it difficult to hold down jobs or stable relationships. The medication she stole was for a rare medical condition she developed in adolescence, a direct result of the trauma she suffered. The corrections officer felt something churn in his stomach. This woman was not an ordinary criminal. She was a victim that the system had failed to protect and now punished for consequences that were not entirely her own. For the first time in 5 years of work, he questioned whether he was on the right side of that gate. In the following days, he began to observe her more closely. He noticed how she avoided eye contact with other guards, how she flinched when she heard heavy footsteps in the hallway, how her hands trembled during the nightly counts. These were not the behaviors of someone dangerous. They were the reflexes of someone who had learned to survive by being small and invisible. One night, when he was on solitary duty, he made a decision that would change everything. He took a book from his personal collection and discreetly left it in her cell, along with a small flashlight so she could read after lights out. It was a clear violation of the rules, but something inside him insisted that this woman deserved at least this small comfort. When she found the book the next morning, her eyes filled with tears. It had been years since anyone had shown any kind of genuine kindness towards her. The simple gesture of consideration touched her in a way she no longer expected to be possible. But other guards began to notice the subtle changes in his behavior. The longer conversations during food deliveries, the extra attention he paid to that specific cell, the way he defended her when other staff made derogatory comments about her. An older colleague pulled him aside one cold afternoon and made it clear that any emotional involvement with inmates would be reported immediately to the administration. The threat was real, and the consequences would be severe. He could lose not only his job, but also his chances of ever working in the prison system again. That night, alone in his small apartment, he found himself faced with a choice that would define not only his professional future, but also who he really was as a person. He could return to his cold and indifferent routine, protecting his career and ignoring the suffering he had witnessed, or he could risk everything to help someone who clearly needed justice and healing. The scars he had seen remained etched in his mind, constantly reminding him that some wounds go far beyond the surface of the skin. The decision came on a rainy Tuesday morning when he found the inmate curled up in the corner of the cell, trembling uncontrollably. During the early hours, she had suffered a seizure related to the lack of medication that her body needed to function normally. The prison doctor had only prescribed basic painkillers, completely ignoring the complexity of her condition. It was at this moment that something broke definitively inside the corrections officer. He could no longer pretend that this was just another routine case. He then began a silent and dangerous investigation into her past, using his time off to visit the public library and consult old newspaper archives. What he discovered in the first few weeks left him perplexed. The institution where she had grown up was called the Youth Rehabilitation Center, a place that should have been a haven for abandoned children. But the sparse news he found suggested irregularities that were never properly investigated. A newspaper article from 15 years ago briefly mentioned an anonymous complaint about improper treatment at the facility. The article lasted only 3 paragraphs and was buried in the final pages of the local section, as if someone had made sure that information didn't gain prominence. During his nightly conversations with the inmate, always kept in whispers to avoid the attention of other guards, he was gathering pieces of a story that became more disturbing with each revelation. She told about the director of the institution, a man in his 60s who everyone respectfully called Doctor, although no one knew exactly what his academic background was. The supposed doctor conducted sessions he called experimental therapy for traumatized children. The sessions took place in an isolated room in the basement of the main building, always with only one child at a time. He said he was helping them overcome their traumas through innovative techniques that traditional science did not yet understand. For 2 consecutive months, when she was only 4 years old, she was subjected to these sessions 3 times a week. The doctor made small controlled cuts on her back while forcing her to memorize complex numerical sequences. He said he was testing how the child's mind coped with simultaneous physical and mental stress. Each scar represented a session. Each mark was a meticulous record of experiments that aimed to map the limits of the psychological resistance of abandoned children. Children that no one would look for, that the system had already forgotten, that became perfect guinea pigs for research that would never be approved by any ethics committee. The corrections officer felt nauseous imagining a 4-year-old child going through those torments. But the inmate had not finished her story. She revealed that she was not the only victim. There were at least 6 other children who went through the same experimental sessions during the years she was in the institution. The discovery that shocked him the most was learning that the director did not act alone. There was a small group of professionals who documented everything meticulously. A psychologist who applied tests before and after the sessions, a nurse who monitored the children's vital signs, and an administrator who kept detailed records of each experiment. They had created a perfect system of institutionalized abuse, disguised as advanced scientific research. They used vulnerable children as laboratory material for perverse theories about human resilience and psychological development under extreme stress. When the inmate turned 18 and left the institution, she took with her not only the physical scars, but also a series of neurological problems that manifested over the years. The rare medical condition that led her to steal medication was a direct consequence of the trauma she suffered in childhood. The corrections officer discovered that the institution had been closed only 5 years after she left, officially due to financial problems. But he suspected that someone had finally asked too many questions about the unconventional methods employed by the director and his group. The most disturbing of all was discovering that the director had not simply disappeared after the closure of the institution. Through a careful search in public records, the corrections officer found evidence that the man had managed to get a consulting position in the prison system itself. The realization hit him like a punch in the gut. The same man who had systematically tortured abandoned children now had influence over the fate of adult prisoners. And even more terrible, he had access to inmate files and transfer processes. On a cold Thursday night, while checking the transfer documents that arrived weekly at the prison, he found something that confirmed his worst fears. The request to transfer the inmate to a distant penitentiary had been personally recommended by the director, now working as a psychological consultant to the system. The recommendation claimed that the prisoner showed signs of emotional instability that required treatment in a more specialized facility. But the corrections officer knew the truth. This was an attempt to silence her before she could talk about what she had suffered in childhood. The document was scheduled to be processed the following week. Once the transfer was approved, she would be moved to a prison hundreds of miles away, where she would be isolated from anyone who could help her seek justice. On that same night, he made the riskiest decision of his life. He would begin to document everything he had discovered, look for the other victims mentioned by her, and try to gather enough evidence to expose the entire network of abuse that had operated for years in the shadows. But first, he needed to tell the inmate about the imminent transfer. When he gave her the news through the cell bars, he saw pure terror spreading across her eyes. It was as if the ghosts of her childhood had returned to finish the work they started years ago. She gripped the cell bars so tightly that her knuckles turned white and whispered something that made him finally understand the real dimension of the danger they were both facing. The words she whispered through the bars chilled the corrections officer's blood. "He knows I have the tapes." Her hands trembled as she explained that during one of the last torture sessions at the institution, she had managed to hide a small tape recorder that she found in the trash in the administrative office. She was only 4 years old, but she had already developed a survival instinct that made her understand that she needed proof of what was happening. With the naivety of a child, but also with a desperate determination, she recorded part of one of the most brutal sessions, including the director's voice, explaining in detail his methods to the psychologist who documented everything. During all these years, the tapes were hidden in a box buried in the yard of the only foster family that had tried to take her in when she left the institution. The adoption did not last more than 6 months, but she had left her only evidence there on safe ground, fearing that someone linked to the director could find them if she kept them with her. The corrections officer realized that those recordings were the key to exposing the entire network of abuse, but they also represented a mortal danger to her. If the director suspected the existence of the tapes, the transfer was not just to silence her, It was to put her in a position where she could suffer an accident away from any witnesses. Over the next 3 days, he worked feverishly to devise a plan. He used his contacts in the prison administration to delay the processing of the transfer, claiming inconsistencies in the inmate's medical documentation. This would give him an extra week, 2 at most, before his maneuvers were discovered. During that time, he began to locate the other victims mentioned by the inmate. The first one he found was a 30-year-old woman who worked as a night janitor in an office building. When the corrections officer approached her at her workplace on a cold night, she initially denied any knowledge about the institution. But when he mentioned the doctor's name and described the systematic scars, the woman broke down in tears. She also carried similar marks, hidden under long-sleeved clothing that she wore even in the hottest weather. She had spent 15 years trying to forget the experiments, building a simple and invisible life to avoid anything that could bring her back to those nightmares. The second victim was more difficult to find. Through old records from the Youth Rehabilitation Center, he discovered that one of the boys subjected to the experiments had become a 30-year-old man living on the streets, addicted to drugs and alcohol. Finding him required several nights wandering through the most dangerous neighborhoods of the industrial city. When he finally located him sleeping under a storefront awning near the train station, the man was in a deplorable state. But his back told the same terrible story, dozens of scars organized in patterns that corresponded exactly to the inmates' descriptions. The most shocking revelation came when the man, in a moment of lucidity between the effects of the drugs, said that he had tried to report the abuses years ago. He approached the police, social workers, even journalists. But whenever his story began to gain attention, something happened. Witnesses refused to speak, documents disappeared, and he himself was threatened or discredited. It was then that the corrections officer understood that the network protecting the doctor went far beyond a few direct accomplices. There were influential people in the system who had an interest in keeping those crimes buried. People who might have financed or benefited in some way from the results of those macabre experiments. The third victim he managed to locate brought a revelation that completely changed his perspective on the case. She was a 30-year-old woman who had become a nurse and worked in a public hospital. When he approached her, she was leaving a particularly difficult night shift. Initially, she also denied any connection with the Youth Rehabilitation Center. But when the corrections officer showed her discreet photographs of the inmate's scars, the nurse turned pale. She revealed that she had not only suffered the same abuses, but that she had dedicated her professional life to treating traumatized children in a desperate attempt to compensate for what she had suffered. The most important information she provided was that the doctor had not stopped his activities after the closure of the Youth Rehabilitation Center. She had heard rumors through colleagues who worked in different hospitals about a consultant who offered experimental therapies for difficult psychiatric cases in private facilities. The pattern was always the same. Vulnerable patients, without close family or financial resources, who were subjected to unconventional treatments in discreet clinics. The nurse suspected that the doctor had simply transferred his activities to an environment where he had even less external supervision. When the corrections officer returned to the prison that night, he found the inmate in an extreme state of agitation. During his absence, she had received an unexpected visit from the doctor himself, who now used a slightly different name and presented himself as a psychological consultant to the prison system. The visit had lasted only 15 minutes, but it was enough time for him to make it clear that he knew about the investigations that were being carried out. He didn't threaten her directly, but he made comments about how unstable prisoners sometimes suffered accidents during transfers, especially those who created unnecessary problems for the administration. Before leaving, the doctor had looked directly at the scars on her back, which became partially visible when she turned to pick up a book. His icy smile was accompanied by a sentence that terrified her. "I see you still carry our shared memories. I hope you have learned to keep certain memories safe." It was a clear reference to the tapes. He knew of their existence and was sending a message that he had the power to reach her wherever she was. The transfer was no longer just a distant possibility, it was a death sentence that was approaching rapidly. That night, the corrections officer made the most dangerous decision of his life. He would retrieve the tapes before the transfer was carried out, but to do this, he would need to break several laws, put his career at risk, and face people who had demonstrated that they were willing to do anything to protect their secrets. Time was running out, and the doctor was clearly one step ahead of them. But there was something the man didn't know. The corrections officer had discovered a personal connection to the case that would change everything, a revelation that he himself was still trying to process, and that would make that fight much more than a matter of justice for a stranger. The revelation that changed everything came in a phone call that the corrections officer received at home on a Friday morning. It was from his aunt, a 60-year-old woman who had cared for his younger sister during his adolescence. Her voice trembled when she said that she needed to tell him something that she had kept hidden for more than 15 years. His sister, who he had always believed had been treated in a specialized clinic for eating disorders, had actually spent 2 years interned in the same youth rehabilitation center where the inmate had been tortured. The aunt confessed that she lied about the location of the treatment because his sister had made her promise that she would never tell the truth about what happened there. The corrections officer's world crumbled when he understood that his own sister had been one of the victims of the doctor's experiments. The dramatic changes in behavior that she presented after the 2 years of internment, the refusal to talk about the treatment period, the constant nightmares, and the self-harm that began after leaving the institution, all made sense now. His sister had never fully recovered. At 30, she lived isolated in a small town, working as a librarian and avoiding any kind of deep social contact. She had built a functional but empty life, trying to forget traumas that she had never been able to process properly. When the corrections officer called her that same morning and carefully mentioned the doctor's name, the silence on the other end of the line lasted almost a minute. When she finally spoke, her voice was that of a scared child, not an adult woman. She confirmed that she remembered the experiments, the sessions in the basement, the scars that she still carried hidden under conservative clothing. The discovery gave the corrections officer a personal motivation that transcended any sense of abstract justice. Now he was fighting not only for the inmate, but also for his own sister and for all the other victims who had suffered in silence for years. On Saturday morning, he obtained permission for a special outing from the prison with the inmate, claiming urgent medical needs that required hospital follow-up. It was a risky lie, but his 5 years of exemplary service gave him enough credibility that the request was approved without many questions. Together, they traveled to the house where she had been briefly adopted after leaving the youth rehabilitation center. The family that had taken her in had moved years ago, but the new owners allowed them to search in the yard. After 2 hours of digging under a fruit tree that she remembered perfectly, they found the buried metal box. The recordings were preserved, despite the years buried. They were 4 old cassette tapes, each containing devastating evidence of the experiments. The doctor's voice was clear and recognizable, describing methods of psychological and physical torture as if he were discussing routine medical procedures. On one of the recordings, it was possible to hear a child clearly crying, while the doctor explained to someone how controlled pain could be used to map specific neurological responses. In another, he discussed how different ages responded differently to the same painful stimuli, treating children as objects of study. But the most shocking discovery came when they found not only the inmates' recordings, but also a second box buried nearby. Inside it, there were photocopied documents that showed that the experiments were part of a research project funded by a private organization interested in interrogation and psychological control techniques. The documents revealed that at least 30 children had been subjected to the experiments over a decade. Each child was catalogued by number, not by name, and the results were meticulously documented in reports that were sent monthly to external funders. The corrections officer and the inmate spent Sunday organizing all the evidence and contacting an investigative journalist who had shown interest in cases of institutional abuse. When they presented the recordings and documents, the journalist was shocked by the extent and organization of the crimes. On Monday morning, the journalist published a series of explosive articles that exposed the entire network of abuse. The recordings were played on major news channels, and the doctor's voice became recognizable throughout the country. The documents clearly showed the participation of multiple people and organizations in the financing and execution of the experiments. The public reaction was immediate and devastating for those involved. The doctor was arrested at his home before he could even try to flee. The psychologist and the nurse who participated in the experiments were also detained, along with 3 administrators who had facilitated access to vulnerable children. The organization that financed the experiments faced federal investigations, and several of its leaders were indicted for crimes against humanity. The revelations led to a complete reformulation of regulations regarding research involving vulnerable minors. For the inmate, the exposure of the crimes brought not only justice, but also freedom. Her case was reviewed by a judge who recognized that her crimes were a direct consequence of the traumas suffered in childhood. She received parole and access to appropriate medical and psychological treatment for her conditions. The corrections officer faced a disciplinary investigation for violating prison protocols, but the extraordinary nature of the case and the results obtained resulted only in a temporary suspension. When he returned to work, he found that he had completely lost interest in keeping prisoners behind bars. He resigned and began working in a small local organization that offered legal and psychological support to survivors of institutional abuse. His personal and professional experience made him particularly effective in identifying similar cases and helping victims find their voice. His sister, encouraged by the success of the case and the public revelation of the crimes, finally sought the psychological treatment she had needed for years. For the first time since adolescence, she began to speak openly about her traumas and actively work on her recovery. The inmate found stability in a simple but dignified life. With proper treatment, her medical conditions became manageable, and she got a job at a small bookstore where she could work with people without facing the stress of complex corporate environments. 6 months after the exposure of the crimes, she and the corrections officer met again, this time as free people in a small coffee shop near the bookstore where she worked. They talked about how their lives had changed and about the work that still needed to be done to help other victims. They discovered that they had developed a deep connection based not only on the shared experience of seeking justice, but also on the mutual understanding of how trauma can be transformed into strength to help others. Together, they began working on similar cases, using their personal experiences to identify and support other victims of institutional abuse. The story ended not with a traditional romantic ending, but with something deeper. 2 people who found purpose and healing through the common struggle for justice, transforming their pain into tools to build a safer world for vulnerable people. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment on what you thought of my story, giving a score from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.